So the masses have spoken, and I guess we're about to do the longest motion tracking tutorial that's ever been made in general, and specifically we're going to be doing it with Blender's motion tracker, which is a part of Blender that doesn't seem to get enough love, even though it's probably the best part of Blender. It is the best free motion tracking solution out there, and oftentimes it's better than paid solutions like Synthesize, 3D Equalizer, Buju, things like this. So if you ever wanted to know anything about Blender's motion tracker, or you're just learning about it for the first time, this is the video you should watch. I have my hair up Zuko style because I'm expecting to be here for a couple hours. We have a lot to cover. I wrote it all down on a sheet of paper here. We're going to be covering the beginning stuff, the intermediate stuff, and then we're going to get into what I consider advanced topics. So let's begin, I guess. Opening up Blender, this is version 2.8. If you're watching this in the future, like 2.81, 2.82, unless the motion tracker gets a major overhaul, which I would love, but I don't think is going to be the case, everything is going to be identical or very similar with maybe a couple interface changes. So the first thing on my list, the first thing we need to talk about is what is the purpose of this tutorial? What is it that we're going to be learning about? So we are going to be learning about motion tracking, and this is the idea of taking footage. You film something with your phone or with a camera, and you want to extract data from this. And we're going to be talking about ways we can do that, and that's pretty much the idea of motion tracking. You take video, extract data. Now, the creative process usually comes after that. What do you do with this data? What are you putting into your scene? What are you attaching onto your data? And I guess we'll talk about that a little. But here we're just going to talk about raw motion tracking techniques. So we'll see what ends up coming up. Okay, so first of all, you took some footage on your phone. All the footage that I'm going to use for this tutorial was recorded on a phone. You cannot just use this video in Blender's motion tracker. Technically you can, but you don't want to. So the issue here is we're using video files, and Blender tends to have some syncing issues. If you do a video file and track some stuff with it and then do some stuff later, and then you close down Blender, next time you open it, 9 times out of 10, things will be out of sync and you would have wasted a lot of time. So what we need to do is take this video and convert it to something that is fail-proof. It doesn't fail-safe, fail-proof. Either way, you're going to convert it into something that has no issues whatsoever, and that is an image sequence. This is the most important thing to start off with. We do not track videos, we track image sequences. And you can convert this very easily, but we want to convert it with Blender. We want to do everything with Blender. So suppose we have some footage. Let me just open up my folder. Here's pretty much the list of topics we're going over. So let's say we have some footage here that we're going to open up with VLC, and we want to track this, right? What we need to do is import this into Blender, find a way to convert this into an image sequence, which is something I've already done, but I'm still going to show you, and then we can actually track it. So the way we do this is inside of Blender, you want to open up the video editing workspace, and this is where you can take a video and convert it. So first of all, we need to add in our footage. So add, movie, and then navigate over to where your footage is. So for me, I have this giant tracking folder. And we're going to load in this footage. Okay, so we have our footage in here, and there are a couple things we need to do before we can export this as an image sequence. The first thing is, if you have a very, close, careful eye, you're going to notice that something is looking very different here, and that is the color space. That is pretty much the view transform that we're seeing. The colors here have been altered, and we need to bring them back to standard. The way we do this is you go to the Render tab. You're going to scroll down to Color Management. And here's where we control all our color stuff. So in View Transform, you're going to be seeing that it's set to Filmic by default. And this is good when you're rendering stuff, you're modeling, blah, blah, blah. Not good for this. Here you want to go back to Standard. And you see there was a very subtle change. I'm going to just flip between them. Filmic, Standard. It's very important to go back to Standard because there's a lot of detail we don't want lost because we're doing Filmic mode. So that is the first thing we need to do. And then the second thing is we need to trim our project in point and out point. So here it's starting at frame 1 and ending at 250, so it matches with our video. So in this case, I'm just going to delete the audio. So select the audio strip, X for delete. We're playing through it. Okay, everything's fine. We can skip towards the end. Okay, so it looks like we want to end it pretty much on the last frame. And if you have blurry footage at the very end, like it goes out of focus, you want to trim it a bit before that. Okay, so last frame is 234. Hover over this, hit Control C. It will copy by just hovering over it and hitting Control C. And then Control V. So now our endpoint is 234, and you can see this is now matching up. And if we go to the first frame, which this is a shortcut we're going to be using all the time, Shift left arrow. For the endpoint, Shift right arrow. These are going to be very useful for tracking. So now when we play through this, we have our whole footage. It's going to, cache through this, whatever. But everything is looking fine. So now we just need to export this. Output tab is where we're going to do this. You're going to see we have this very weird frame rate. And this is because my phone is not the best at recording things. It will try, I say, do 30 frames per second. What does it give me? 29.95. But whatever, this is one of the issues that we want to fix. So we have this frame rate that was automatically synced to this one. And we also have this resolution synced up. It was 1080p. And we want to export this as an image sequence. I recommend PNG. You can do JPEG, which will be a smaller file size, but you're losing detail. And with tracking, you want to maintain as much detail as possible because that is what you're going to be tracking. If you're like degrading your footage, you're going to have less to grab onto, which is not what you want. So PNG, or you can get crazy with EXR, but PNG works, 0 compression, and then hopefully you don't hear that. There's some stuff outside. Hopefully that's not a big deal. And then you want to set a output directory, and I'm just going to put this on the desktop in a new folder, test sequence. We're not actually going to be using this one because I made sequences for all of these, but so inside test sequence, we can just call this test sequence underscore, so it's going to be test sequence 000 and then 001, or it'll start with 001, etc. That's just the indexing. Click accept. And now we are all good. We have changed our color space, all our frame rates are matched up, etc. So just hit Control F12 to render out the animation. And you see it's going to go frame by frame. It's a very quick process because it's just taking the frame of the video and then saving it as an image. There's nothing really to render out that's super crazy. So you just want to wait for this to finish. It might take a second. I brought a lot of water because I'm assuming my throat is going to get sore. I think that's going to be the case. So wait for this to finish. Should be done in a second. And you're going to need to do this every time you're tracking something in Blender. Do not use video, use an image sequence. Believe me, okay? Just do it. Okay, so it should go to 250, I think. Oh, 234 because we trimmed it. Okay, perfect. And now when we go to this folder, you're going to see we have all these images, which are all our frames, and this is what we want. Again, I've already made this, so I'm just going to delete it. But that is what you want to create. So now we have our image sequence. Okay, perfect. So now we've taken the video, converted it into something we can use, and we want to begin talking about tracking, which is the point of this video. So we're going to delete everything in this sequencer because we don't need it anymore. X, delete. And I like to go back to the layout workspace. You don't need to do this, but just do it. Layout workspace. And then in the output tab, since we're now using an image sequence, which is just a list of photos, it can be in any frame rate. Doesn't need to be 30 frames per second, doesn't need to be 60. It can be whatever you want. So that's another advantage. Of course, we want to match this as close as possible because when we play this at speed, we don't want it to look like it's twice the speed. 30 frames per second, that's close to 29.95. Okay, so now we have this nice 30 frames per second, and we want to start tracking. So here's the 3D viewport. This is not where we do it. All our work, 99% of our work, is going to be done in this movie clip editor. This is where we're going to live. This is where we're going to do our tracking. There are a couple exceptions, like we're going to do some compositing. Is going to be pretty useful. A tiny bit of stuff into 3D viewport. This is where we're living. And you're going to see that we have nothing. We can zoom in and out. There's nothing here. So we want to click Open, which is where we import in our, not footage, but image sequence. Navigate to your image sequence. So for me, it's this folder, sequence. And to import it, you can either click this first one, and it will automatically recognize this as a sequence. What I like to do, again, this works. What I like to do is hit A. That's going to select everything. Open. Both of these work. Okay, so now we have this loaded. And when we scrub through the timeline, you see this is indeed video, and it's very slow. Not too slow, but very slow. Probably a bit slower because I'm recording right now. So there's a couple things we want to do to speed this up. The first thing we want to do is make sure our in point and out point, start point and end point, I don't know what you call it in Blender, I guess start and end point, you want to make sure those are matched up. And of course they are, because we did the video sequencer stuff in this thing, but assume that, let's say, we have 300 here and we need it synced up. Well, you can do a couple things. You can either find where the last frame is and then say, oh, change your endpoint, or what I like to do is just hit Set Scene Frames. You hit this button and it will automatically recognize where the last frame is. So look at that. So in this case, it goes to 200. Of course, we had 234 before, but I already rendered out the sequence before and I trimmed it a bit earlier. So Set Scene Frames will automatically fix this for us. So if we have something like 50 and 60, what we need it to be is 1 and 200. Hit this button, it will automatically do it. The next thing we want to do is load this video into memory so it doesn't play so slowly. For that, you hit Prefetch. And you see this purple line becomes a solid purple line, and that means this frame is cached. When we play this with spacebar, everything is playing at real-time full speed. You can see the frame number here. And you can see the resolution is also matching up, and everything's good to go. Okay, so we have our footage imported. How do we begin tracking? Well, this is where it gets really, it's simple, but this is where there's a lot to talk about. We're going to start off very simple. So I'm going to track this dot right here. That's why I filmed it. And we're not going to worry about any of these settings yet. We're just going to use the default settings. To add a tracker, hold Control and click. So that's Control click, and you're going to get this little tracker. We can delete it with X, add one here, doesn't matter. So I'm going to add one here. We can move it around with G, which is, I don't know if I said that word, with G, which is the same as the way you do it. I mean, anytime you move something in Blender, you're hitting G. Applies here too. We can also scale with S and rotate with R. So G, S, and R, pretty much like any other part of Blender. So we want to make sure that this tracker is pretty much covering our dot. We don't want it inside, we want the whole thing. Perfect. And there's a lot going on here that we're not going to talk about yet, but we have this pattern area. That's what this is called. It's called the pattern area. And this is what we're going to be tracking. Basically, this little texture, or this little like chunk of our footage. We're going to be tracking this little square. And to track, you can open up this menu right here. And you're going to have all these controls. And we can track all the frames at once or one frame at a time. To do one at a time, you hit this button. Pretty sure? Yes. And you see now we're on frame 2. And you can just keep hitting this, and it's going to track along. And you can see it's leaving behind this little trail. And when we go back, you see that's pretty much defining the motion path. So let's just track a bit more. And you just want to make sure that it's really staying centered. And one thing you can do if you don't like this motion path or you want it shorter or longer, in this menu right here, we can change the path to be disabled or enabled. We can change the length. I'm going to keep it at 20. And to track the rest of this without going frame by frame, and the shortcut for this, as you can see, is Alt right arrow. So Alt right arrow, frame by frame. To do the rest of this, I think it's this button. Yes, this button. Or you can use the shortcut Control T, and you want to be using shortcuts. So Control T, and it's going to track all the way to the end, all the way to frame 200. And this was a very easy track. If it has issues, it will stop halfway through. Okay, so we have this track. If we want to center it so we can actually see if it's good, you can hit this button right here, or you can just hit L for lock. Is it for lock? I think that's what it's for. Yeah, it's for lock to selection. And when we play it, it stays centered. Okay, cool. And the reason it's staying perfectly centered is because it's such a good track. Okay, so this is tracking on perfectly, but let's say that we want to clear all this data. So for some reason we don't like this or we want to redo it, you can hit this clear button. So this is clear to the right. So everything beyond this frame is going to get cleared. Hit that. And now let's do the same process backwards. So I'm going to go to the last frame, that's shift right arrow to go to frame 200. I'm going to control click to add in a tracker, S for scale. This time to track backwards, which is also something you can do, Alt left arrow. And you can hold, or you can click L to center this. To speed this up, you can hit this button right here or Shift Control T. So it's Control T, but with a shift. Shift Control T. Look at that. That is tracking beautifully. And something about Blender, something that's a little bit weird. If you know about how it's actually programmed, I'm sure you know why this is the case. Backwards tracking is a bit slower than forwards tracking. I don't know if it's like trying to access the frames of the video in a weird way, but it's slower, even though it's the same thing. I don't know why, but you should get pretty identical results. We can stop it at, whoops, you can click this to stop it at any point. So we have this tracked, and then once we go beyond this point, it's not going to be tracked anymore. We can then, on this frame, we can move it, so it's now tracking almost the same thing, but really it's tracking like the perimeter of this, and then we can keep tracking, and now we're tracking this area. So you can move it mid-track, so Shift Control T to finish that up. Of course, you wouldn't want to do that. You want to keep it at the same point. But look at that. That is looking good. Okay, so some other things we can do just with this very simple setup. Go to this tracking tab on the right over here, and you can see a whole bunch of stuff. First of all, we see this kind of zoomed in view that updates as we play. And this is a good area to adjust. You can just move it like this. You can hold down Shift while moving it to get fine control. This is a good area to adjust it, and also a good area to see if everything is lining up. Like that. Some other things we can do, I'm just going to delete this tracker and go to the first frame. So I'm just going to add a tracker, Control click, S for scale. So some other things we can do is we can really dive into the settings here. So in the tracking settings extra, you see a whole bunch of stuff. First of all, you're going to see the speed, which is going to be, you know, how fast is it tracking. Right now it's going as fast as possible. We can turn it to quarter speed, Control T to track forwards. And now we're very limited here because Blender can go much, much faster than this. It has great algorithms. But now we're seeing it at a very manageable speed. We can stop it at any point, make a tiny correction, G for grab, and then Control T to continue. And if we're very confident with this, we can bring it up to fastest and Control T. And you can see that's much faster. So that's the first thing. That's kind of like playback speed, but it's tracking speed. The other thing that's very important is this frames limit. Right now what we're doing is we're saying track forwards, and it will keep going until it reaches the end or it has an issue. So here's what we can do instead. We can add a tracker, scale it up, and take our frames limit to, let's say, 15. So now we have 15 inputted, and when we hit Control T, it's going to track to frame 16. 1 plus 15 is 16. Hit Control T again, it should be 31. Let's see. Yes, 31. And then 46. I'm doing math. It's tracking 15 frames at a time. Why is this useful? You may think, oh, track all the way to the end. This is a very easy shot. In hard shots, there's going to be motion blur. It's going to get occluded by things. You can't track the whole thing. You want to go a couple frames at a time and then do a little adjustment. Make sure it stays centered. So maybe it goes a little off center. Do it again, etc. So that's why you might want to use that. Okay, so that is the very basics of, just tracking a point. But of course, there's a lot more nuance. There's actually things hiding here. If you hit Alt S, what do you get? You get a search box. So now we have our pattern area, which is, what we have before, and we have our search area. That is a hard word to say, area. So here, these two boxes are doing very different things, and it's important to understand this. So this pattern area, what it's doing is saying, this is what we want to track. So each frame, it will take this little pattern and try to match it. it will try to match it, and that defines the motion path. But the question is, where should it search? Is it searching for this dot in the whole video? No, that's crazy. You want to limit the amount of area you're searching for this pattern, and that is what the search area is, right? So if we make this very big, very, very big, and let's actually make a new tracker for this. So I'm going to make a tracker, scale it up, and then scale up our search area so it's very big. So remember how fast it was tracking before. Now when we hit Control T, it's so much slower. I've already hit it. It's not even updating. It's so slow because it's searching this giant area for this tiny little pattern. So of course, the advantage of this is you're probably not going to have your pattern leave the search area. The downside is it's taking forever to calculate. So you need to find this balance. It's actually not that slow, but sometimes you track 20 trackers at a time. Here we're just doing one at a time, which is not what you usually do. So really, once you get into complicated shots, you want to consider how fast you're tracking. This can actually become an issue. So the bigger the search area is, the longer it's going to take because you're searching a larger area. And similarly, the bigger the pattern area is, the more time it will take as well, because now it's trying to match a bigger pattern. So you really want to keep both of these as small as possible without losing any accuracy. So let's try to make this as small as possible and see how fast we can get this to track. So I'm just going to scale this so it's barely bigger. We can see it right here. And we can scale this down. It might be too small, but we'll try it. Control T. Look at that. It's already done. So what might happen sometimes is if you're moving the camera very quickly, this this pattern area will be like over here on the next frame, and it will have exited the search area, and then the track's going to stop. So you need to make sure this is big enough to account for how much motion you have going on. And I think that's all I want to talk about for this very simple example. Let's go over a couple other things. So right now when we control click, you see always the same things happening. That it's using these settings over here. If we make the pattern size bigger, when we control click, it's going to start off with this giant pattern. We can make the search area big. So this is pretty much the loading settings. And then once we have a specific tracker, let me add another. Once we have a specific tracker, we can then modify the settings of this. So we can go to the marker settings. And here we have a whole bunch of stuff like the position. I don't want to talk about offset yet. This is very important. We're not going to talk about it yet. We have pattern area and search area. And this actually brings up a good point. We can use this little handle to rotate and scale nicely. We can also move each point in our pattern individually, and this will become important when we do perspective tracking. What else can we do? We can scale, S for scale, and then Y, only on the Y-axis or only on the X-axis. And of course we can rotate. So we really have full control over this. And something I want to make very clear, let me just get rid of these. When we add in a tracker, and let's say we're doing, this is a perfectly set up tracker. If we take some points and kind of distort it, as you can see over here, we're getting a lot of weird distortion. None of this matters. This is just the pattern we are looking for. The data are really kind of like where the tracking is happening, like where the center of the track is, this dot right here. This is the only thing that matters. We can even get crazy with this, bring it all the way over here. All that's fine. When we are looking at the quality of a tracker, we're just looking at this point right here. So let's try to track this forwards. Okay, so we got a perfect track. And yes, it kept this weird deformed pattern area, but this center remained where it's supposed to be. Let's hit L to center, L to center. So yeah. So what's happening here? Here we are tracking a piece of footage and extracting X and Y data, horizontal data, vertical data. Where do we see this? In here we can go to the graph option. Let's zoom that out. Okay, so here we are seeing this red and green graph data. I'm pretty sure red represents X data, Y represents Y data, and this is pretty much the numerical representation of what our tracker is doing. So here it's going to have some initial X and Y position, and then this means, and in terms of the red, it's going one way, and then it's going to go another, and then back and forth in this wave pattern. And the reason the reason it's oscillating so sharply, that there's a lot of noise in this, is because the camera was very shaky. And you can see that here. If we had very smooth camera movement, like we filmed this on a dolly or something, both these graphs would be very smooth. And let me split this window and bring this back to clip. So let's go to the first frame. So now let's focus only on this red X graph. So here it's moving. Let's turn off lock so we can actually see it moving. So here it's moving to the left, which means this red's going down, and then it should start swinging back over to the right, and then back to the left and to the right, and the same kind of thing applies for the green Y data. And I don't want to really talk about extraction yet, but one thing we can do is in our 3D viewport, I'm going to delete everything except for the camera. We can take this tracker, and once we're done with it, hit Control L to lock it, or you can just hit this button right here to lock. And this will mean we can't overwrite this data. It's locked in. We're done with this track. So with this track selected, we can hit Reconstruction, Link Empty to Track. Okay, what did this do? You see, relative to our camera, we now have this data represented in an empty. So if we play this, you can almost see, this dot moving around. In our camera properties, we can enable a background image. And then in movie clip, I'm pretty sure, we can load in our sequence. And you can see that this empty is now over the dot. So when we play this, you see it's tracking on perfectly, and it's relative to the camera. So we can move it. Let's reset it to 0 and bring it up. And you can see this is tracking on perfectly. And this is actually an empty object, so we can scale this down and it will still be in the correct position. So we can add in something like a cube, a smaller cube. And we can take this, let's make sure it's centered. We can take this, shift-click the empty, Control P for parent, and then object. So now our cube is parented to the object. So this is kind of like a very first lesson in 3D integration. So what did we do? We tracked some data, we put it inside our 3D scene, even though it's only X and Y data, which is why it only exists on this floor plane. And then we just parented a 3D object to it. And this is just the very basic. So that was just location-based tracking. If we go back here, you see we were using the location model. And the next thing I want to talk about is, going up this list. So we're going to talk about a location rotation. I think we're going to skip this one and then go to location rotation scale, affine, and then perspective. So in the next part, let's talk about location rotation. So we finished doing location-based tracking, which is really the most simple case we can handle. We want to be able to add layers of complexity and be able to track more difficult footage and just be more flexible with how we can track. So what we basically need to do is just add layers of information, new channels of information that we can track and make use of. So far we've been doing location-based tracking, which means we have a pattern and we are seeing if we can match it by just translating it around from frame to frame. So if we add rotation, for example, we're moving it around and we're also rotating it, which is going to be much more powerful for a whole different group of trackers. So for example, I have this footage right here. Let me just play that. And you can see we have this twig or leaf or whatever it is on the floor, and we want to track it, but of course there's rotation going on. So location motion model is not really going to cut it. We can test it and see where it fails. So in the movie clip editor, we want to import in the new sequence, and let's just find where that is. So tracking, location rotation, and you want to either click the first one or A for all of them and open clip. Just like last time, we want to hit set scene frames to make sure this 250 turns into whatever it's supposed to be, which is 200, and then prefetch to load this whole sequence into memory. So we can see we can play this in here. Everything looks exactly the same. Our color space is still in standard, and our frame rate is 30 frames per second. Because it's an image sequence, we can do whatever we want. If we use the location-based model, let's actually see what happens. So we're going to add in a tracker by control-clicking and scale this up. We can hit Alt-S for the search box, and I'm just going to get some water here. And we want to make sure our search box is sufficiently large and also our tracker area, or our pattern area. So we do not need to track the entire twig. Even though this has the most amount of data, even tracking a small section of it should be sufficient as long as Blender can grasp onto this pattern and see where it's actually moving to. So again, we're using the location model, and if we hit Control T, let's see, actually, it makes it to frame 12, which isn't very good. It seems to really need rotation. If we were very stubborn about this and wanted to just continue using the location model for some reason, we can go to the last active frame, which is frame 11, and just update this a little by hitting G for grab and then just moving it a little bit. Effectively, what this does is it adds another keyframe. So from this point on, Blender is going to be referencing frame 11 and trying to match that to future frames. So initially, we add frame 1, we add a keyframe. Frame 2 references frame 1, so does 3, 4, 5, etc. And now, on frame 11, we've added a new keyframe, a new reference point if you want to think about it like that. Control T is going to let us get a bit further. We run into an issue. We can scale it. That's another way to add a keyframe. Try to make it a bit further. And basically, every time it's rotating a bit too much, it's going to fail. So what we can do to fix this is into track settings. And then in here, what we can do is we can change the model to location rotation. And from this point onwards, it would track that way. So for example, location rotation. So we've now changed the model that this tracker is using. So if we Alt right arrow, you see now it's actually tracking on fairly well. Of course, I'm just going to restart this from the beginning. So we're going to start off on frame 1, and then we're going to use a location rotation for our default settings. Add this in, scale it up, and then hit Control T. This is a lot nicer. So you can see that really Blender is accounting for what motion model we're using, and there really is the best choice in most cases. Sometimes there's a bit of gray area, like is it location rotation or location rotation scale? Sometimes you can play around with it a little, but in general you want to pick the motion model that works best for what you're doing. So you see this is tracking on very well. We can see this in our little zoomed in area right here. You can see that this twig is perfectly vertical in the search area, not the search area, this pattern area, which means that the rotation is very accurate, or otherwise this would have a bit of rotation in here. And something that's very important to mention about this is that even though, and this is important, so listen up, even though we're using the rotation or location rotation motion model, and it's accounting for rotation by when it's matching the pattern, it's not going to be storing rotation data. Again, the only thing the tracker stores is the location of the center point. Even though we're using rotation to find it, it's not storing it. If we go to the graph data over here, you're going to see it only has X and Y data, nothing to do with rotation. Well, why is this a big deal? Well, maybe you would have thought that we can use this to attach an object to it and it will rotate with it. That is not the case. For rotation and for scaling data, for that matter, you're going to need two trackers. So location is obviously only one tracker, you just follow the track. For rotation, it's going to reference two trackers and see the angle between them, and for scale, the distance between them. So let's say we actually wanted to get rotation data out of this. What we would do, again, is we would use two trackers. So I'm just going to add a tracker on this end right here. Again, it's using the location rotation model, and then add another one over here. And there's no reason that two different trackers can't use different models. They're separate. You can do whatever you want. But this example is very important because most of the time you're tracking multiple things at once. So hit A, or just click one and then shift click to select both, and then Control T. And it's going to track both of them forwards a bit slower, probably twice as slow because it's doing twice the amount of computations. But you see this is very good. We can hit Control L to lock both of these trackers. And relative to both these trackers, we can actually get rotation data. So they start off vertical, pretty much vertical to each other. And then the angle between them kind of, you see this pivoting. I'll show you what I mean in a second, but this is enough to get rotation data. So for example, last time we did the cube example, I just want to show you how we might extract something like this. So let's delete both of these and then take our camera and for properties and center it just like last time and just bring it up. This is just a nice and tidy way to have everything set up. We're going to select all our trackers and they're both locked. That's very important. And then in reconstruction, link empty to track just like we did last time. And with these empties, we can just scale these down so they're not too big. And with our camera properties, we want to add a background image, movie clip, and then just choose this sequence. So now we can see what these trackers are attached to essentially. And to make this brighter, because it's not matching this is not a 3D viewport issue. We can just take this and bring the alpha to 1, so it becomes completely opaque. I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but some other things we can do with this, by the way. For the depth, we can set this to front, and then the video is essentially above our trackers. It's in the foreground. Or you want to keep it in back, is what you usually do. You can make this also completely transparent if you want to. But if we play this, you see that everything is attaching nicely. So how do we actually extract something similar to rotation data? This is not going to be the perfect example, but it's going to kind of illustrate a point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in this time, let's do a plane, scale that down, maybe make that kind of the shape of our twig, roughly. A bit smaller. And what we're going to do is we're going to pin some of these vertices to one tracker and then the other vertices to another, and that's going to kind of be like rotation, but really it's just going to be a deformation. So to do this, last time we used parenting, and if we parent, so Control P, we can only parent to one object at a time. This doesn't have any of the rotation, as you can see. It's just staying vertical. So we're going to want to undo that. Okay, so what we want to do is with this plane, go into edit mode, and then with the vertices, select the bottom two. We want both of these to be connected to this empty. So with these two vertices, control click the empty, and then Control H for the hook menu, and then hook to selected object. This is going to pin our vertices to this empty, and now when we go to object mode and play, it's kind of hard to tell, but these vertices seem to be pinned. Let's do it for the other pair. So plane, edit mode, select both of these, control click, Control H, hook to selected object. And now when we play this, it's not really rotation, it's kind of like a skew, kind of. And you see this isn't very, very good once you get to the extreme of horizontal. But this kind of has rotation data. As you can see, there are ways to do this properly by using an armature. You can hook the tail to one and the head to the other. We're not going to worry about this for now. I just want to illustrate that two empties have more data than a single empty, and they, in some sense, have scaling and rotation data. So if these two trackers were to go further apart, our plane would deform by stretching. Okay, so that is that. And actually, we can just delete that. And one thing that I thought about doing is for each layer that we go up, so now we're on location rotation, I just reveal one more setting that we could play with, right? So for example, I want to talk about Normalize, for example. It's not going to be very relevant for this piece of footage, but it is something, so let's just delete these trackers. So what Normalize does, as you can see in the description, normalizes light intensities while tracking. What this means is that when it's tracking, right now it's already counting for translation, for rotation, it's trying to match the pattern what happens if a shadow gets cast over the twig? Well, from our eyes, we have human intelligence. We can see, oh, it's the same twig, it's just a bit darker because it's in shadow. Blender sees this as a different pattern. All the pixels are darker. So Normalize, essentially what it does is it averages out the light intensity, and in most cases it can actually ignore these lighting changes. So it makes it invariant to lighting changes. This is going to be slower to process because this is just another thing it has to go through. But if I was to, cast a shadow over it, generally it would work. Also the other way around, if somebody was to shine a flashlight, if it wasn't too drastic of a change, Normalize would actually fix this. So let's actually see if we can see any speed differences. There shouldn't be too bad. So this is a normal tracker. This is how long it takes. And then we enable Normalize. Shouldn't be too different. Control T. It's a bit slower. Nothing crazy. But if you only have, in this case, only 2 trackers, enable Normalize. These 10 seconds that you're losing, they don't matter. You're losing 10 seconds. You're getting something that's invariant to lighting. And who knows, maybe when I filmed this, I was standing above this. Maybe my shadow slightly cast over it. Anything is possible. So again, with this tracker, with this motion model, I just wanted to reveal another thing in the tracker settings, Normalize. And now what we want to do is move up just another notch, just one more layer of complexity. And we're going to be going to location, rotation, and scale, which is going to be pretty much what we've been doing, but also account for scale, which is, it's not the tracker getting bigger or smaller, it's the camera getting further and closer to the tracker, making it seem like it's bigger and smaller. Again, we have the human intelligence. We know, most of us, we know that the tracker isn't changing size in most cases. What's really happening is it's a machine, it's Blender, it's looking at video, it's looking at data. It doesn't know any of this context. It just sees this getting closer and further away, or this thing rotating. It's not really rotating, it's the camera that's rotating. Whatever, we know this. So now let's just add another layer of complexity in the next motion model. So we've gone over tracking location and even rotation, and at this point you may be thinking there's no way we can up it from here. There's nothing else we can add to this. Well, you would be wrong, because we have location, rotation, and scale. And as we've just been talking about, scale isn't really the idea of trackers themselves getting bigger and smaller in most cases, but really it's just the camera getting closer and further away from a tracker. And if you're just viewing this as 2D footage, that is the same idea as scaling. So I actually have some footage that illustrates this idea perfectly. So here we have this thing on the sidewalk. It says no dumping, drains to stream, and we're using this to go closer and further away, and it's also rotating, and we're moving the position. So this is really the perfect example for location, rotation, scale. And of course I've already turned this into an image sequence. So we can import this in by finding the folder and then either clicking the first one or clicking A and then open clip. And this is imported, except we don't see anything. And you need to think, why is that the case? Well, first of all, let's go to the first frame with shift left arrow. That will go to the first frame. And then if I open up our timeline, we can see we have an endpoint of 200 frames, which isn't necessarily correct for this footage. So we need to hit set scene frames. Gives us 190, which is where I trimmed it apparently. And we need to hit prefetch to load this into memory. So just get used to hitting these 2 buttons one after another. It's pretty much how you set things up. And you see we have this footage imported. Okay, so just like all the other times, we're going to see the limitations of the methods we've been using so far before using, in this case, location, rotation, and scale. So the last motion model we used is location, rotation. So let's try to add a tracker with this and scale it up. Of course, we don't need this whole emblem sign thing. We can just get this fish part of it. And let's try tracking this with Control T. And it will probably make it pretty far. Oh, so it stopped on frame 27. And what's happening here is it's capturing the position of the pattern, the rotation of the pattern. It's matching from frame to frame, but it's not getting the scale. And this thing is getting closer and closer. So on frame 26, we can just add a keyframe by scaling this up, Control T, How far does this make us? Is it going to stop? Is it just going to keep going? There we go. So again, this is a brute force approach. You don't want to do this, but it does work. So instead, we're going to close this down and change the motion model to location, rotation, and scale. And we're almost all the way up the ladder. Pretty much every one is better than the one under it. That's not always the case, but it's generally true. Location, rotation, scale. We're going to add this in, just like that. And again, we need to remember what's happening here. We're tracking 3 channels. Again, we're not holding this data, but we're using 3 channels of information to match from frame to frame, matching a pattern by translating, rotating, and now scaling. So Control T, it will start tracking soon enough. And of course, this should be slower than the other two because now we're handling even more possibilities for Blender to check. We can make it even worse by enabling Normalize. So it made it to frame 34 immediately, which isn't too bad. We're just going to scale this up and also make our search area smaller since I don't think it's going to escape outside of it. Control T. And of course, some other reasons that this might not be holding on is motion blur. So let's just do one more round of this. Okay, so at this point, I want to introduce an idea that will probably help us not add a new reference point every 15 frames or so. And essentially, the way we've been tracking is we have a reference point, and then it's trying to match this pattern until it can't do it anymore, and then we add another reference point, and so on. This isn't, for this case, apparently it's not the way to do it. So there's another setting that I want to talk about for this, and that is, where is it? It's right here, it's match. For this tracker, the match is set to keyframe. And that is essentially what we've been talking about. So keyframe, what does it say? Track pattern from keyframe to next frame. Exactly what we've been talking about. Reference point and then matching. Instead, we can try to do this one right here. Missed it. This one right here, previous frame. And what this does is every frame turns into a reference point so that each new frame is just referencing the one before it. So it's not referencing 15 frames ago when we had our last keyframe, but instead it's continuously updating the keyframe. This would be great for something like this, as long as it doesn't make a small error, say that's fine, and then keep amplifying it. That's the danger of using previous frame. But for this case, I think it will work. So let's do Control T. And I think it is holding on a lot longer. So again, this is the power of previous frame. You're going to get more drifting. That's what's going to happen when you use previous frame. But you can always go back and refine it. So, you know, not the worst thing in the world. You could use this as an initial pass and then you correct some stuff in the graph editor. That's something you could do. But you see this time it made it all the way down. And really, this is the power of scaling and also the power of previous frame. So that's not too bad. And just like all the other times, it's so important to note, this tracker is using rotation and scale data. It is not storing it. Again, graph, you see only X and Y data, nothing else. And it's all staying very centered. Doesn't look like it here, but if I'm trying to zoom out, whatever. If we zoom out and kind of squish this down, I don't know what I'm doing wrong with this, whatever. If you squish this down, it's all staying fairly centered. You see it's bounded between 10 and minus 10, which means that our point, which is pretty much in the center of the footage, is remaining very centered. The X and Y locations aren't changing that much. So one more thing I want to talk about before we move on. Again, this doesn't hold scale data. Very important. One more thing I want to talk about, though, is we've already talked about Normalize. But probably one of the most important things you could play around with is this correlation value. So I'm just going to read out what this says and then explain it. So minimal value of correlation between matched pattern and a reference that is still treated as successful tracking. So if you understood that, that's great. Most of you probably just heard a bunch of nonsense. So here is what's going on with the correlation value. So the tracker has a reference point. It goes down a frame and tries to match the pattern, in this case using location, rotation, and scale. Now, unless you have like a perfect camera and this algorithm does it perfectly, the pixels that it's going to match this onto aren't going to be identically the same. There's going to be some noise in your footage, or maybe the lighting changes a little. So it matches it with some degree of tolerance. It's not 100% sure that it's a match. So with every frame that's tracked, it also has this value of confidence. You can think of it as, so a confidence of 1, which is 100%, means this is definitely where the tracking should go next. This is where the motion path should lead. Correlation, or confidence of 0, means it has no idea what it's doing. And basically this correlation value is setting up a tolerance. So if we said 0.75, for example, it's saying keep tracking until you go one frame and you have a confidence of under 75%, and then just stop. So here we're saying stop when you are under a certain degree of confidence. And I could talk about this all day, or I can show you what it means. So let me show you what it means. I'm going to add a tracker, but before I do that, let's set a correlation, not of 1, which is ridiculous, but 0.98. So it needs to be 98% sure every frame it goes down, or else it has to stop. And to make this more drastic, we need to keep it on keyframe and not previous frame, because it makes it easier to match if it's previous frame. Let me just add one right here. So what we expect from this is it's going to stop very frequently, because there's no way it's going to be above 98% sure each time. But we'll see about that. Control T. See if it makes it even one frame. Okay, so it stopped 13 frames down. From here to here, it wasn't completely sure. Oh, giant mistake. You guys are probably yelling at me. I was changing the correlation here, which is what we, the settings we have when we add a tracker. We need to be messing with the correlation values here. I'm sorry, it was a mistake. Let's do the same demo. Correlation of 0. We'll see if that just keeps tracking no matter what. I think that should be the case. Is it? Yep, it's still going. It's going very slowly. You see here it started going off, but it should just keep going because it has a correlation of 0. So even if it's 0% confident, it will just keep chugging along. Yeah, you see this zigzag pattern? This is why you need a high correlation to avoid issues like this. So we're just going to close that down. So let's position our tracker back here, bring up the correlation to 0.75. So it needs to be 75% confident. And now we're getting something that's sticking on much more in the center. So sorry about that mistake I made earlier, but pretty much everything I said is correct. I just changed the value in the wrong area. So again, we're getting it to stop here because we only have a correlation of 0.75 and it must be under 75% confident that it can continue. So that is the location rotation scale with information about correlation and match settings for keyframe and previous keyframe. Okay, well, what's next up the totem pole? What's the next thing we need to learn about? Well, that is going to be, what's it going to be? It's going to be Affine. Affine. Okay, so let's do Affine. Let me get a bit of water and then we'll do Affine. Okay, so you may be wondering, we've done movement, rotation, we've done scaling. What other type of motion even is there? You want to be thinking of distortion. And what do I mean by this? Well, what affine refers to is stretching and skew. So if we had a square and it's like on a piece of fabric and we stretched it, it would turn into a rectangle. Now, scales uniformly, so it won't pick up on the fact that it's turning into a rectangle. That deformation would cause it to stop tracking. Another thing is if we took a rectangle and skewed it, so it becomes kind of this diamond shape, so one side goes up, one side goes down, that's another type of deformation that rotation can't handle, location can't handle, and scale can't handle. So let me just give you an example of something like this. So we have affine. Let me just bring down the audio. I had somebody help me record this, had a bit of a conversation. So here we have a dirty sock. I used to use this for running long distance, but It's a dirty sock, and I put a tracker marker on it, and you see here we're doing some deformation. This is the stretching, and this is the skew I was talking about. All the tracking methods we've done so far they would just not handle this well. So this is where Affine comes in, and of course, like every step before it, it's going to take more computation time, but it's worth it. Affine, generally when we're tracking things, you want to use Affine. You can sometimes use the thing above it, which is perspective, but generally we're just using Affine. Of course, you may be thinking, oh, if everything beneath Affine is covered by Affine, why not just use it? Well, if you're sure that something only has location data, you can use that because it will save you so much time, and you might avoid some inaccuracies that you might gather if you're also checking for other things that wouldn't necessarily be there. So let's do this Affine. We're going to import in the sequence. Did I just import in the same thing? I think I just did. Let me try that again. Where is it? Tracking, Affine, sequence, import. There we go. Okay, so first thing we need to do, set scene frames 1 to 111 and then prefetch. So I cut out the beginning of the footage that had all the setup and the end where I moved my hands off of it, and what we are left with is just the stretching and the skewing, which is all we need. So I'm going to try location, rotation, scale. It might work. I highly doubt it though, because of the reasons we talked about. Location, rotation, scale. We can even enable normalize, lighting conditions, whatever. And in this case, there might actually be some changing in lighting conditions because light is gathering in the crevices of the wool that will change when there's bigger gaps in between. It's kind of minute, but it exists. And we want the correlation, 0.75 is fine. Okay, let's turn off lock so we can actually move. Add a tracker, scale it up, and in this case we want to scale on the x-axis to cover this whole tracker. So this is location, rotation, scale. Take one, let's see how it does. I'm thinking it will stay on for the beginning of it, and then it will lose it once we do too much stretching. Okay, so it's doing well so far. How embarrassing would it be if it made it all the way through? I guess it is making it all the way through. I don't know what to tell you. Well, it made it all the way through. So I guess what that says is that this is not a great example of Affine. But I guess because it's such a simple design, it really does just look like scaling and then rotation. But either way, we're still going to go through the Affine example because it is much better at stuff like this. And this really is the perfect example for Affine. This is really an Affine transformation. So same setup as before, and now Control T, and see how this does. Now, if this let go of the tracker at some point, I would be shocked, because Affine is destined for something like this. So let's see how it does. And if anything, this might actually be more accurate, so that's one reason to not use location, rotation, scale. It might have held on for the whole thing, but was it centered? Probably not as well. Because again, it's approximating these things with scaling and rotation. It's not the same thing as Affine. Okay, so here we have a very nice Affine deformation. Look at that, that's really nice. And we can lock that in. And something else we could do is if we wanted to, this is a very weird tracker. So for example, we could put a location tracker here, 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 and here. So we have 4 trackers, and we can have a little plane that deforms with this cross. But that's just something we can do. Let me see if we can experiment a bit more with the Affine. This might not work, but it's just something I want to try out. Let's say we're trying to track something that isn't really a tracker marker, because so far we've just been dealing with, perfectly placed tracker markers. Let's try tracking part of this bracelet. I don't know if it's going to work. We're using the Affine model. Rotate this a little. We'll see how it does. I wouldn't be shocked if it works perfectly. Yeah, that worked pretty well. You see at the end we're getting a bit of pinching that isn't necessarily there. But this is staying on fairly well. And again, this is the power of the Affine motion model. I pretty much drop this on anything. If we instead try location, rotation, scale, I want to see what happens. So we can, in these tracking options, we can clear everything past this point. So we have a fresh tracker. And let's try changing this to location, rotation, scale, and see if this does the same thing. It might. I don't know. Control T. Now, something you're seeing here is this bounding box, this pattern area, is always staying a square. Well, why is that? Well, because it's not deforming at all. And you may want that, you may not want that. For the sock example, the actual sock, you definitely don't want that. You actually want the deformation here, so it's not always staying the same aspect ratio. But that is the Affine settings, and I think we are now ready to move on to the big kahuna. This is the one that is the most powerful, but you don't want to use it all the time, and there are reasons for this, and that is the perspective. Dun dun dun! Perspective is very good. It does significantly better than every other motion model, but it can be abused and it can be broken. So first of all, let's get some footage that we want to track with perspective. So we have these tiles here. Specifically, I want to focus on this tile. And notice that we're revolving around it, but not in a rotation kind of. It's not just rotating. We're not looking at it and then it's just turning. This is a perspective change. We're looking at it from a different angle, is the way you want to think about it. Especially when we dip the camera down here. And this is the idea of perspective. So perspective tracks planar surfaces. It's very important. It tracks planar surfaces. If you did this on a curved ball, it would sometimes work, not the greatest idea. So it tracks the perspective deformation of planar surfaces. And in this sense, this is Blender's real planar tracker. There are other things in Blender called the plane track. This is Blender's real planar tracker that accounts for a planar geometry in a very accurate way, and the perspective thing's actually much faster than you'd think. So let's close this out and open our perspective sequence. Set scene frames, 1 to 200, and then prefetch. Okay. So let's play through this footage, make sure we have what we want. Okay, perfect. So there are a lot of things we can do here with perspective, and here I want to introduce a new kind of idea, which is normally you think of trackers as tracking these tiny little markers, maybe the size of a twig like we saw before, but never something huge. And the reason for that is because it's too much data and it can slow things down. With the perspective tracker, I highly recommend taking the extra computation time to take big surfaces. There's no reason not to. Just because it's a tracker doesn't mean it needs to be a small point. It can be a giant planar surface. So let's enable perspective, even enable normalize, and I'm going to bring the correlation up pretty high. So not only is this checking for warping, perspective warping, true planar tracking, not only is it averaging the light intensities with this normalize, and not only, well, and the last thing is that it needs 90% confidence each frame, or it's going to stop. And we're going to use the keyframe model, which is even more ridiculous. I wonder how far this will go. So we're going to add in a tracker. And like I said, this is going to be huge. So we're going to take each of these corners and line them up to the cracks in this floor. And you can see in this view right here what we're doing. This is actually a very good example for this. I'm going to make this a bit bigger so we can actually see the cracks on the edges. Make sure that's there. And then we need our search box to be not too big, but a bit bigger. We'll see if we need to make it even bigger than this. The motion isn't too drastic, so I doubt it. So again, we expect this to be extremely slow. And just in case we have a crash, I'm going to save. So Control T, see how it does. I expect this to be very accurate. And you can think of each one of these tiles as its own perspective track, but of course there's a smarter way to do this where you put the trackers on the cracks in between where there's these crosses. But I want to try one whole tile. Now if this is too slow, we might have an issue, but we'll see how this does. And later on, when we apply all the, again, this is just the fundamentals here. When we apply all these concepts to things like object tracking, camera tracking, we're going to need to pick and choose what kind of tracker we're using. And oftentimes I use the perspective tracker whenever we have planar surfaces, even if it takes a long time to calculate, an incredibly long time. Okay, if this is not going to do anything at all within the next 30 seconds, I'm going to, shrink this down, but same idea. Yeah, you'd think that tracking is something that doesn't take a lot of time. You're just matching small bundles of pixels within pretty small search areas, but it can get pretty ridiculous, especially when you automate the whole thing. You can do what is essentially automatic tracking in Blender, and I think we'll cover it. We'll see. Yeah, I don't think this is going to fly. 10 more seconds, and then I think we're going to quit this one. By 10 more seconds, I mean now. So let's cancel this. And hopefully the canceling doesn't take too long. So again, we have a bunch of different approaches. We can either make this smaller so we only get this small piece of the tile, or do the crosses. And I say we do both. So let's scale this down. And look at this pattern. It still has a lot of detail. It should work. Of course, it might be a little, it might be a little too similar to everything around it, but we'll see. And it turns out that I think it did actually end up tracking one frame, but I'm just going to clear everything behind it. So now we only have frame 2. And let's try tracking backwards a frame. I did Alt left arrow. We're going to see if that processes. Oh no. If we get a freeze, I'm going to be disappointed. There we go. Now, something I want you to know is that it's not really this slow. Usually it's that I'm also recording with OBS, which makes everything maybe twice as slow, but whatever. Control T to track forward, see if it actually works this time. There we go. So again, we don't really need to focus on this on these 4 corners. I mean, they'll be pretty accurate, but expect a bit of shaking. What we care about is this center point, which we can view right here in this. I keep calling it different things. I want to call it search area, but that's already taken up by this terminology over here. But you can see that this center point is staying exactly where it's supposed to. So let's have it do a couple more frames. And you can see how this really is planar tracking. We're essentially tracking a chunk of a planar surface, pretty much the same thing you do in Mocha or with the planar tracker in Fusion. I just wish there was a spline-based solution here. But this is what we got. And you see it's starting to speed up a little. What we can do is cancel this, so it stops at whatever frame it's going to be at. And we'll find out what frame that is in a moment. Okay, so here we can bring down to search area, make that a bit smaller even. That should speed things up just a little more. Yeah, there we go. Now we're zooming. If you thought modeling was thrilling, if you thought lighting was thrilling, this is where it's at, motion tracking. But seriously, I've seen a lot more motion tracking type things on the Blender subreddit, so a lot of people are taking interest to it. I think that's great because nobody's really integrating real-world footage with Blender, which is kind of some of the cooler stuff in my opinion. You can model all day and make these Pixar type things. I'm not that into it. Whatever. Okay, so I think we get the point. This is very accurate if we play through this, especially if we lock with L so it stays centered. This is very accurate. Again, that zoom out was because we changed our scale, but again, only focus on the center point, even if it zooms in. And of course, at this point, it stopped tracking, so it starts vibrating. But this is a very accurate track. So let's try doing the cross solution. with perspective tracks, which is great because we have this cross that's going to be deforming as we move around. So I'm just going to make these pretty small. Center it here. And then we're going to add 4 of them and see if we can track 4 at the same time. Make that smaller. And this is going to be the basis for something very soon, which is what Blender calls plane tracking, which requires 4 corners like we're doing right now. Well, we'll see if this works. Again, the fast version of this, the fast approximation of this is Affine, which is kind of like a pretty good but weak approximation of what we're doing here with perspective. So A to select everything, I'm going to save, and then Control T. And you see, this is what I'm normally used to. It's pretty fast. You see a lot of them got detached. So let's pick this one, for example. So it ends, let's see where it ends. And again, it's not unexpected that it stopped tracking. We had a 90% tolerance. Pretty high. So let's add a keyframe, have it keep going all the way to the end. Perfect. And by the way, the reason it stopped tracking is as we move around, I want you to focus on this area here. We're kind of seeing, even though it's very shallow, the depth of the crack as we move around. It's actually changing more than just planar perspective. It's a 3D surface, but we approximate it with this 2D planar surface. But you can see what I mean. It's kind of slightly changing here. So let's scale this up a little and have it finish. It really does not like that frame. Let's see if we can just expand our search box. There we go. Now it's working through that. Sometimes you don't even need to do the manual correction. All you have to do is just a bit of editing on your search box. Okay, so this one ends around here. Make that bigger. And this time, it makes it all the way to the end. And then finally, what do we have? Did we get all of them? We didn't. We need this one. And keep tracking from there. Perfect. So now we have these 4 trackers. We can play through this. Turn this off. And if we really want to see what this is looking like, this isn't the best way to view what's going on, but what we can do is first of all disable the paths so we can just see these tiny squares and how they're moving around. Looks very accurate. And we can also actually hide the footage, so we just see these squares. And if you can kind of see this tile, if you can imagine it, then it's a pretty good track. And in this case, I think we got it. In this case especially, you can really see in this area right here how this is changing as a 3D surface. In the beginning of this, you can see this center of the cross, and then as we change angle, you can't even see it anymore, which is why it's somewhat of a difficult track. Okay, so let's enable this. And then I said with each track, we're going to introduce a new idea. With this one, I want to talk about, again, it's not relevant to this shot, but I need to talk about it at some point. And that is this RGB, black and white. What's that all about? So again, in this case, we're doing perspective tracks. So Blender will take a pattern and do all these perspective deformations and see which one will fit with the next keyframe. And if it can do it, it will keep tracking. Keep tracking. I am really losing my voice here. It's okay, I'm almost done recording for this session. You saw I changed shirts, right? I was getting like, it was too much for a moment, but so it's doing all this tracking and it's taking this data of the pixels in R, G, and B. That's red, green, and blue. You know what we can do to actually speed things up? We can track only one channel. So we can track only the blue channel or only the green channel or 2 channels at a time. And in some cases, this is actually a very good idea. So for example, let's say we have, trying to think, let's say we have a green screen, and on that green screen we have like an orange marker or something like that. which green and orange are pretty similar, especially when it's just a dot on a green screen. So in that case, you might want to ignore like green, for example. And then if you're left over with red and blue, you might see a lot more difference there, or maybe the opposite. Maybe you only want to track green because that's where the real difference is, the whole green screen versus this thing that's slightly off green. Whew, this is too much. And then another thing we can do is just track black and white. But what I recommend is keeping RGB unless you have some reason to only track one color channel, or you're like, you know what, I don't care. I'm going to take away like what is essentially a third of the computation time. You're tracking a third less data because you're not checking blue channel, or maybe you're checking 2/3 less. So that's the idea with that. So my throat, I just cannot talk anymore, but this has been the very first part of, I don't know what I want to call this, the most extreme motion tracking tutorial out there. In the next part, which is going to be long, this is a long tutorial series, we're going to be talking about applications mainly, and then some things that I deliberately left out, like join tracks. What's that about? And then most importantly, the feature nobody knows, nobody knows about it, is offset tracking, which is right here. We have offset tracking, and this is the idea. I'll just give you a taste. Right now we're tracking this area, but what we can do is with some magic, we can keep our point right here, but track a different area. So we can get data from here, but put the information over here. So that's why it's offset tracking. You're offsetting your tracker, but keeping the center point where it's supposed to be. Just a taste. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this very first video. This was just the core fundamentals. I know I took it very slow, but that was the point. We just wanted to go over the theory, the image sequences, the motion models, what each of these do except for location scale, but I think you can infer. That's a good way to tell if you understood this tutorial. Do you know what location scale does? What scenario would you use it in? You know? But we've gone over the motion models and pretty much most of these important settings. We left over a couple things like detect features, and we'll get into that eventually. But thank you guys for watching. If you want to support more videos like this, have a Patreon. I have 24, 25 people who are donating on Patreon. I want to say thank you. If you guys are watching this, I really appreciate you guys donating money to free content on YouTube. You don't need to, but it's very nice that you do. If you are a viewer and aren't on Patreon, on my Patreon, consider it. But thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys on the next one. And for the people waiting for the tracker marker removal tutorial, it's coming. Probably after these videos, but I make them somewhat quicker because I'm not editing this giant, it's not a masterpiece, this giant scripted video. But it's coming soon, probably within a week. Thank you guys for, I need to stop talking. Thank you guys for watching. I tried to keep this as interesting as possible, even though it's a very slow format. I'll see you in the next one.